on July 25th, 1850. A Baltimore clipper ship full of Chinese goods had almost completed its voyage, 6,000 miles from China to San Francisco, when disaster struck along the Mendocino coast. It was a time of gold. Everyone had traveled to the west, searching to become rich. With this sudden boom in population came a large boom in inflation as well. Many people searched in the ground for their dreams of becoming rich, often ending up poor due to high prices. Many merchants profited from this large inflation, in particular, a man by the name of Augustine Hurd. Augustine Hurd had lived most of his life on the ocean. It only made sense that he would create a business around his love of sailing. This business became known as Augustine Hurd and Company. Hurd constructed a small fleet of ships to begin trading Chinese goods, in particular opium, from India to China.
It was built by a group of Boston merchants, proper Boston merchants, to be sent down to China to get involved in the opium trade. So we had a group of very proper Bostonians looking to make money in the opium business.
The ships he had built were the Dart, the Don Juan, and the Frolic. Hurd knew that it was a long voyage from the opium port of Bombay in India to the port of Canton in China, and knew he would need fast ships to make this voyage. Hurd looked to the Gardner brothers, who had received fame for their fast ships, to build the Frolic. The Gardner brothers would receive fame later, not for one of their ships, but for one of their employees, Frederick Douglass.
In entering the shipyard, my orders from Mr. Gardner were to do whatever the carpenters commanded me to do. This was placing me at the beck and call of about 75 men. I was to regard all of these as masters. Their word was to be my law. My situation was a most trying one. Frederick Douglass.
It was one of the last, fastest U.S. clipper ships to be built in Baltimore in the 1840s. Speed was a critical element, and if you could get just a tiny bit more speed, that had many benefits.
In fact, the Gardner brothers designed the ship in the shape of a V instead of the standard U in order for the ship to travel much faster. All they needed was a captain. Hurd's partner, John Dixwell, knew the man for the job. His friend of 28 years, Edward Horatio Faucon. This was no ordinary captain.
Well, first of all, the captain is famous. He was a Frenchman by the name of Faucon, a very, very competent captain, incredibly unique because he had been the model for the author Dana 2 years before the mast, written in the 1840s.
Captain Faucon was a sailor, every inch of him. He knew what a ship was, and was as much at home in one as a cobbler in his stall. I wanted no better proof of this than the opinions of the ship's crew, for they had been 6 months under his command, and knew what he was. And if sailors allow their captain to be a good seaman, you may be sure he is one, for that is a thing they are not always ready to say. Richard Henry Dana, Jr., 1840. Faucon began making voyages from Bombay to Canton, bringing back loads of opium and tea. The Frolic would continue to be profitable for Augustine Hurd and Company for many years. However, it was suspected that the Frolic was leaking. Some of the ship's cargo had been damaged on the voyages. After taking many trips, the bad news was evident. The Frolic's hull had rot. Soon the ship would be useless. Dixwell and Hurd decided to have the Frolic make one final voyage for all of the money that they could get out of the ship. Their new destination was not back to India, but to the booming city of San Francisco. With the large inflation, Augustine Hurd and Company would be able to sell the products for extremely high prices. However, the ship still had rot, and making it all the way to San Francisco would not be easy. Failure was in their minds. They got the Frolic highly insured by Lloyd's of London.
So they took this latest, highest speed, beautiful sailing ship, and decided the best way to make some money out of it is load her up with a bunch of Chinese goods, send it off to San Francisco in 1850, which was booming because of the newly discovered gold.
So Faucon gathered up a crew to sail with him.
He had the first and second officers were English or American. He had 24 crewmen made up of Lascars, which are Portuguese-speaking Indians, Indian-born, and some Chinese. So the captain, 2 first officers, I think a first mate, and this crew of about 23.
On June 10th, 1850, at 8 a.m., the Frolic set sail from Canton. It would be her final voyage. The Frolic was loaded up with a large variety of Chinese goods: silks, tables with inset marble tops, toothbrushes, game pieces, silk fans, 6,009 bottles of ale, and 21,000 porcelain bowls. The voyage would last 46 days. Finally, on July 25th, 1850, at around 7:15 p.m., the captain sighted land. The sun was setting, and Faucon could only see the faint outlines of mountains about 60 miles away. Feeling confident, the captain went below deck and let the first mate take over.
Later that day, as they continued, in the evening, he went below. About 8 o'clock, the first officer took over. They could see, again, these mountains and this moonlit night coming on, still feeling they're well off the coast. What they didn't realize is there was a fog bank lying over the shoals and the benches, which we now know is that bench land that runs all along the coast there. Instead, they were looking at the mountaintops some miles behind. So thinking they're still 20, 30, 40 miles from the coast, they sailed on into the dark.
The Frolic pushed forward towards the rocky coast. Suddenly, the first mate spotted waves breaking over a reef. The Frolic was headed right for them. The first mate yelled orders to turn the ship, but it was too late. The force of the current pushed the ship into the rocks.
First of all, it destroyed the rudder, so they couldn't steer. It was on the reef, in fact, and immediately taken on water.
The ship began to sink and tail to its port side. The crew was forced to abandon ship immediately.
They had 2 small boats. They launched those. 4 of the crew members, terrified, refused to come off the mast, climbed the mast, and would not get off the ship.
They could see only rocks and cliffs, so Faucon ordered his men to row south. They would end up 7 miles down on a beach at the mouth of Big River. Here they are able to reprovision before continuing on in their boats to San Francisco.
So the next morning, the captain and the 2 officers and an injured crewman and 4 other crewmen who he selected and said, "You will row," took 1 boat, the other was damaged, and began rowing south down the coast.
After sleeping on beaches and eating mussels, they made their way to San Francisco. When they arrived, Faucon told his story to the Daily Alta California. However, evidence today shows that Faucon's story may have been false. Faucon explained that he left the ship floundering on a reef some 100 miles to the north. Evidence today shows that Faucon did not leave his ship on the reef. In fact, he sailed the ship as far inland as he could. He knew it would be safer for his crew if he were able to bring the ship right up close to the shore instead of navigating rowboats through the dangerous reef. So after colliding with the reef, Faucon brought the ship right up to the beach. When describing his story, Faucon did not want his employers to lose money, so rather than explaining that only half of the cargo was salvageable, Faucon described how it was completely destroyed. Lloyd's of London believed his story.
And in fact, Lloyd's paid off.
The story that was printed in Daily Alta California was titled Shipwreck and Loss of Life. Faucon had estimated the value of the ship at about $150,000. The news of this wreck had brought a few people north seeking to salvage the wreck. One of these men was named Harry Meigs. Meigs had been involved with the lumber industry and had recently purchased a mill at Bodega. This mill required a large labor force to ship the lumber. Having been attracted by the news of the Frolic, Meigs decided to set up a lumber mill on the Big River. This became the first white settlement on the Mendocino coast. This settlement would soon turn it into the town of Mendocino.
By the time Harry Meigs arrived in the area of Mendocino, a large portion of the easy salvageable cargo had already been taken. Years later, archaeologist Thomas Layton would discover Chinese pottery shards in a Pomo Indian encampment, which eventually would lead to the discovery of the Frolic wreck. Today, scientists and researchers still make dives on this sunken ship. They continue to unravel history with each dive that they make. 150 years after the wrecking of the Frolic, remains from the ship continue to wash up on shore, only a few hundred yards from the wreck, on the beach at Point Cabrillo. For many, this may seem like a story of treasure. However, it is history. Our history.